Well, welcome everyone. Superintendent Johnson sends his gratitude for your attendance and to those that are attending online. I'm John Meisner. I'm the ESL and Professional Development Coordinator here in Iron County. And we'd like to welcome Senator Osmond and Superintendent Menlove to this meeting. And gentlemen, the time is yours.
Wonderful. Sure, I'll just, can you hear if we don't use the microphone, or do we need to use the microphone?
Use the mic. Use the mic.
Can I take it out?
Sure.
Yes. All right.
It is a lot more cord if you want to walk around more.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate the opportunity to interact and spend a few minutes and get some feedback from you. We have, this is the second of 3 meetings that we have scheduled around the state to meet with educators. We're interested in getting feedback from administrators as well as teachers. I don't know, I should look at my list. Pilot schools or pilot districts in this area on the evaluation. Who do we have that's doing it? Anyone? I guess.
NWA and Cedar.
Okay.
We have a Beaver district. I don't see them here.
And they're doing the evaluation pilot, right? Anyway, Senator Osmond, as you know, was here a year ago and spent some time with us. And again, we're just interested in any type of feedback and what we can do as we approach the next legislative session and what changes we may need to make to the bill or to the legislation now. And also as we do some things at the state office to make sure we're implementing it as it's written and as it's intended to do. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Senator Osmond, and we'll just kind of take turns answering questions and go from there. So Senator, please.
Thank you, Superintendent. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be here with you this evening. I have to admit that I broke some state law to come down here and discuss state law. It was a very fast drive. But I would like to first just see by a raise of hands how many administrators that we have in the room with us this evening. Great. And the rest, I assume, are educators. All of you are educators, but the teachers in the room, can you just raise your hand as well? So a good mix of both. I want to start off this conversation this evening by just giving a quick summary of the intent behind Senate Bill 64 to make sure that that kind of lays the framework for our conversation this evening. Often legislative intent and then the passage of legislation and then the implementation of legislation are very different things. And we're on this tour to make sure that the intent of legislation and what is actually implemented are consistent and aligned. And in some cases it doesn't in the way that it's been communicated. I'm sure not purposely in an incorrect way, but sometimes misinformation is propagated, and we're here to try to address that, as well as to discuss and hear from you about what do we have to watch out for now as we move through the next couple years of the implementation of this important piece of legislation. So is it okay if I just take a few minutes and go over what the intent of Senate Bill 64 was? Then you won't feel like we're wasting time this evening. I know it's precious. All right, so when I first went around the state a year ago, what I heard from teachers and administrators, I posted in a blog called Lessons Learned. Do some of you remember that document? That document was the basis of conversation that I and the State Office of Education, the State Board, the UEA leadership, the Superintendent's Association, etc. We all participated in a conversation of how can we. What's going on behind me?
Corey.
Oh, is somebody online? Okay, I apologize. He walked in and walked out. Corey. Well, we'll get back to him later. When we passed this legislation, when we started working on this legislation, here was the goal. What I learned was that we as a legislature had spent too much time worrying about getting rid of bad teachers as a legislature. We had a hyper focus that the way to solve our problems was to rifle shoot away the bad teachers in our system. That somehow that was the legislature's responsibility. That's kind of the general message that was being conveyed, whether it was intended or not. And as I went through and met with all of you, what we discovered is that we really needed to focus on leadership. With the greatest respect for leadership and the enormous pressure that is put on our administration, we needed to focus on our leaders. Because I learned, and what I now strongly believe, is that the quality of instruction within our school systems lies with the administrator, who is responsible to set that tone and ensure that there is quality instruction happening in every classroom. So we need to focus, the purpose and intent behind Senate Bill 64 was to evaluate our administration and find out how they were doing their jobs and ensure that they knew that we cared about the way that they lead. Now that is the core of this bill. That we identified that we were going to do an annual evaluation of administration, the criteria that we were going to use, the 4 categories that we're going to use to evaluate their performance, and the timelines. And then in addition to that, we recognize that in order to support administration in the challenging job that they have, we also had to clarify some issues relative to teacher evaluation. And as part of that, we made a few changes. One of the key changes is that we made it clear in the bill that as part of the annual evaluation of administrators, that there would be at minimum 2 components: the quality of instruction and student progress as part of the teacher evaluation, in addition to other criteria that would be allowed for between the state office and the district, so that it wasn't just one factor. That was a very important piece. There was a lot of concern and anxiety about whether or not a teacher should be evaluated solely on student progress, and we concurred that that was not the right thing to do. There are so many unique factors. And then we also introduced 4 levels of ratings that teachers would be graded on. We didn't name them. We identified that there would be 4 levels, with the first level being the highest. And then we tied compensation to, meaning access to, a teacher's regular salary schedule. We created a gate that simply said, if you are not ranked in the top 2 of the 4 levels of annual evaluation, that you would not qualify for access to your regular salary schedules based on years of experience and the other items that are used to determine your schedules. Now for administrators, we said that your evaluations would be tied to performance as well. That over time, however long it took us, that as administrators received increases, those increases would become part of variable compensation that would be tied back to their individual performance evaluations, until such time in the future that 15% of their total compensation was tied to the result of their annual evaluation. Okay? And then finally, we went through and we made multiple modifications to the orderly termination process. We did that in partnership. Remember, this was all done together with all groups at the table. We clarified code, made it easier to understand. We limited the amount of time for remediation for a performance problem to 120 school days, start to finish. We said that if there was repeat performance problem within a 3-year period, that the district did not have to go through remediation again for that same performance issue. We also restricted principals and administrators from moving teachers that had performance problems simply from one school to another without dealing with the problem. And we made other clarifying components and the importance of due process. was reinforced in the code and clarified in the code. So that was the big picture. The most amazing part about the bill was the unity of which we achieved this reform. When it finally came through both the Senate and the House, from a legislative perspective, it passed unanimously. But more importantly, the organizations involved that represented the institution of education in the state, including the UEA, were 100% behind it. Now the challenge that we have is communication and implementation. So knowing that it would be challenging, that it would still ruffle feathers, that it would be difficult, and we'd have to figure through some things, and the state office would have to define a fair and valid evaluation system and put those tools and systems in place. And administrators would need to be trained on how to use those systems. And administrators would have to, at the district level, would have to know how to evaluate and oversee their principals and evaluate them and put those fair and valid systems in place. We knew it would take time. And so we put several years out for implementation. In fact, final implementation, or initial implementation actually, isn't until the 2015-16 school year. So recognizing that we had those challenges, we put buffer of time in there. And I just want to start off by saying, as we go through this, and if we find that we're having challenges and we need extra time, we need to do this right and respect for the professionals on both sides of the issue. The great educators that we have and the great administrators that we have. And I can tell you, based on what I've witnessed, the state office is very serious about doing this fairly and the right way, and so am I. So that's my summary. That only took about 8 minutes, but I wanted to make sure you had that context. And with that, Superintendent Menlove and I would like to spend the rest of this hour or so really hearing from you. And if you wouldn't mind, just stand up and say your name and where you're from, your school, and your role as you get up. I'd really appreciate that. So we'll go ahead now and start to our Q&A portion. Who would like to be the first guinea pig? Anyone would like to stand up and share their feelings or thoughts or questions?
Oh, yeah, he would be there.
Yes, sir.
Question, I thought that on the total compensation, you got that changed a little bit because we give insurance increases and stuff like that. It was really hard to attach those things to the salary, and I thought.
Are you talking about the teacher piece or the administrator piece?
The administrator piece, where a percent of raises until it's 15%.
Correct.
I thought we got rid of the total compensation.
Yes, I'm sorry. That's a great clarification. You were right.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. The total comp in my mind was the relative to direct salary compensation and not benefits. Yes, excellent point. Boy, if that's the easiest or hardest question tonight, I'm going to be really happy.
I broke the ice for you.
Thank you. What comments or feelings and concerns do you have? Let's go into anything that you. Yes, sir. Would you stand?
My name is John Dodson, principal of High School. The concern that I'm hearing about, you talked about 4 levels of the teacher, the bottom to the top. And I've heard that, and this is just hearsay, so I'm not sure, that it's going to be publicized.
Great question. You want to address that one, Superintendent?
What will be publicized is the number of teachers in each of those 4 categories by district. Okay? So that's the size it's going to be, but it's an aggregate count of each teacher in each of those 4 categories by district. Okay? That has created a little bit of concern with some of the very small districts. We were in a meeting the other day with Tinnick, and they were concerned, and so we may have to come back and say, hey, maybe in some of our smallest districts, it's going to have to be aggregated differently or something like that. But right now, it's simply the code calls for publishing that data aggregated simply by how many in each of those. The other question then comes up, is there some expectation, there's some type of bell curve in those 4 categories? And the answer to that is absolutely not. There's nothing that talks about that. There has been quite a bit of conversation about currently, if you're looking at that distribution, what you'd find is that in most districts, most teachers are in whatever the top category is. If you have 4 categories, most of them in 4. If you have 5, most of them in 5. And there is some some conversation about publishing that may cause it to look like a more normal distribution, but there's nothing there that talks about what that distribution should look like or ought to look like, nor is there any expectation there.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Christine, I'm fifth grade teacher. Can you tell us what those 4 categories are?
4 evaluation categories.
No. Highly effective, effective, emerging, and not effective, I think, are the 4. We've had some conversation about that, but I think that's the right.
That sounds right.
Does that sound right? Okay.
Just making sure.
Yeah. And looking at some things there on the emerging, maybe someone who's simply new, and not to say that they won't be effective or highly effective. There have been some rubrics already developed on those. There have been some conversations that those rubrics, as compared to current rubrics that are being used by districts to do that, probably create greater expectations or a higher level of expectation for a teacher to reach that highly effective category than are some of the current rubrics in some districts to reach whatever the highest category is in that district.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Catherine Perry. I'm from Washington County Schools. I have opportunity of teaching at an alternative high school. And I'm also part of our WCEA board. One thing that we were concerned about is how test scores are going to be factored in, because we don't have a lot of control over experiences that our students have. The other day I came to school and I had an advisory student that was just giving me a fit. And I pulled him aside and said, "What is going on?" He finally had a home visit with his mother, and while he was there, she was arrested. And then he returned to his proctor family. And if we have things like that going on in our homes, how do we expect our students to come to school, be able to focus on end-of-level tests, and give us a fair evaluation of what they know and how well we can cover the units?
Go ahead. As you know, the state office has spent the last number of years trying to look at that question even in a broader sense when we started looking at evaluating schools and how we can evaluate a school on the east side as opposed to school on the west side, or a school on the north end of town as opposed to the south end of town, or how are you going to evaluate a regular high school as opposed to an alternative school when you know the populations in each of those. And so we've tried to work on some type of student growth model that will actually look at where students are and where they ought to be and where they're making progress to some band of expectation of where they ought to be. We recognize that one of the main issues we're dealing with in this whole process is exactly what you're talking about, how we're going to effectively and fairly measure student growth. The one thing I remind you is that the student growth component is only one of 3 required parts of the evaluation. So your student growth is going to be, or student performance, be that growth or whatever, is one part. Your attributes as a teacher is the other part, and then some type of community, student, parent evaluation is the third part. So recognize that that's a small part of it. The meeting we had the other night, someone was complaining that they taught all the top students and they all were 100% proficient, and so they could never show any growth, and so it wasn't fair for them. The next person that spoke said, "I teach all the low students, they never show any growth, it can't be fair for me." The math teacher said, "Well, God, you're going to test all my kids, so you know how my kids are, but so it's not fair for me," because the music teacher who spoke next said, "You're not going to test any of my kids." Anyway, at the end of that conversation, Senator Osmond and I were talking about those responses, and we said, well, we must be pretty close where we ought to be because we've offended everybody just a little bit. So again, recognize that we understand that. We're in the process now of trying to write some student learning objectives so that we can look at those areas where there is not a standardized test. We recognize that less than 30% of the students, less than 30% of the teachers are teaching students where we have a statewide test. So we have to have some other type of objective measure to look at student growth in those areas. Again, right now we're planning on these student learning objectives. We're planning on teachers having the opportunity to write their own objectives. So if the objective for you in an alternative school is something different than, you know, Mrs. Jones that teaches a straight set of AP history, for which there's also not a statewide end of level test, anyway, so that's one of the things we're looking at and recognizing that that's probably, at least at this point in time, where I think the greatest concerns are being expressed. So thank you. You're consistent with what we're hearing other places.
Absolutely. I just wanted to add that for the administrative side, that we are equally concerned about that. One of the challenges of an administrative role is that in most cases, our administrators or principals came from teaching and became an administrator, and often have not had the professional development from a management standpoint to know how to manage people and their performance and their development. So we have to come up with similar type of support in defining their criteria and evaluating their performance relative to how they handle the evaluation process fairly with teachers. Their 360 feedback, both from teachers and parents, as well as their administrators, the people that manage them, and then other criteria that may be set by the state office and the district. So it's really critically important to us, both on the legislative side and then on the State Office of Education, to make sure that valid and fair instruments are put in place that treat people with respect, but hold all of us accountable in a fair way.
The other part I would add to that, and again, I hesitate to say this because I'll admit I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth a little bit. It's my opinion when we start talking about performance-based compensation, we ought to be looking at groups of teachers working together. Because I really believe that's where we have the greatest achievement with students. Now, when we start looking at performance in administrative evaluations, we have that because we can look at the total school performance. However, I really believe that at some point in time, somehow we need to measure individual teachers' student performance. And again, I don't know how we're going to do that. I can tell personally, in my teaching experience, I probably would rather have been evaluated on the teacher across the hall's performance because her kids probably do better than mine did anyway. But I really think somehow we've got to tie this. But I think that's one caution we need to make, because when we start then talking about pay for performance, which ends up being the next step, which I don't want to even go there because I'm not comfortable with where we're at even now. But then I think we really need to come back and start talking more about these collaborative efforts and what we're doing as professional learning communities or grade levels or departments or those types of things. But at least with this part of it, somehow we need to look at individual teacher, the students that teacher is seeing, and somehow measure performance of those students. And again, obviously it's going to be different in an AP math class than it's going to be in a concert choir class. Brent?
Is there a way where you can do a hybrid of the two? Because PLCs are so valuable, the collaboration is so valuable. And if you've got a new teacher in there and the other teachers are so worried about having their own performance, they're going to leave this person to hang. That's not what we want. You've got a teacher that is underperforming, but they could get there if the other teachers were to work with them as a team. They're going to let them hang because they're worried about the whole thing. Is there a way where you can say, all right, we're going to evaluate your performance. Half of your evaluation is going to be on your performance, and the other half is going to be evaluated on the performance of your team. Because if you're truly a team, you are responsible for what's happening.
And again, when we start talking about those attributes of highly effective teachers, one of those attributes of highly effective teachers is they cause everyone else to be as effective as they are. So we are looking at that, but it's probably, as the model looks right now, it's going to be more measured under that component of teacher attributes than it is going to be under student performance. But it is going to be considered as part of that because we know that that's a critical part of quality teachers and highly effective teachers. So it's there, but it's in that other part.
Kurt Benjamin from Cedar School District. I teach English and speech and debate at Richmond High School. I'm also the SEA president. What portion of the evaluation do you recommend should come from testing? My first question. The second part would be, how can we be sure that it's a fair measure?
Go ahead.
Right. The code requires that we have three components: student achievement, teacher attributes, and the parent. We have not made that determination yet, and we're not going to make that determination yet until we go through some of these pilots and see what type of data we get and whatever type of thing. The most common right now division of that nationally is probably a 40-40-20, with 40% being student performance, 40% being teacher performance, and 20% being some type of outside parental survey or student survey. So that's a common, as you look at much of the research right now, that's the most common division. But again, we haven't made that determination yet. It'll be some combination of those three, but we don't know what it's going to be at this time.
The biggest challenge too that the superintendent already mentioned is that we only have a true adaptive testing capability on a limited number of subjects. And the technologies that we're investing in only allow us to test in that context. And coming up with ways to be able to score student progress in the many other subjects that are taught, and then reflect also the collaborative nature that you were talking about is a very challenging thing to work through. So that's why we've allowed ourselves so much time to figure this out, pilot, test, and improve over the next 2 to 3 years.
Do you have some feedback for me on how you think it ought to be?
Well, I've been hearing the 40-40-20. I'm just curious if that's where we were starting to see it go, or if it was, we had another model that we were looking at.
If I had to say we have a baseline we're looking at, again, that's the most frequent thing we're looking at. But right now, those decisions haven't been made. And again, I would be interested in some feedback from you about that if you have some feelings about that. So.
Well, I think the concern comes from the second part of my question, and that is besides the other curriculum, the other classes that was it's not even in those core classes, what's called core classes, the math, the science, for example. Are we sure that the measuring device is actually measuring what we're learning? Because I hear from science teachers that sometimes that's not the case in an adaptive test that we're exposed to.
Fair enough.
Can I follow up on that? I'm Sue Hasenwinkel. I teach English at Hurricane High School, so I'm from Washington County. And I want to follow up on that with two things. First of all, as an English teacher, I spend about half my time teaching writing. Guess what percentage of the CRT tests writing? 0. Okay? So half of what I'm teaching my students, you don't know from the standardized test whether I'm doing a good job or not. And I'm going to go back to the math and science. The math and science people in our building said, we taught the core. Since they changed the core, we taught the core. And our test scores are the lowest in the district. So we went to the other. For 5 years in a row, they've been the lowest in the district. So we said we went to the other departments of the high schools and said, how do you get such high scores? They said, we don't teach the score. We teach the test. So I would say that goes to exactly what you were talking about, that if the test is the biggest measure of student growth, you're not really measuring everything and you're not measuring it fairly.
We understand your concern, and I hear what you're saying, and my experience has been that it's not always the case that there's a direct alignment between those who I thought were the best teachers in schools I worked in and students who had the highest test scores, and recognize that there are important things that are being taught that are not on the test. We're hopeful that the new adaptive test will allow for some greater flexibility in assessing what students really do know and what they don't know. Again, along with the evaluation matrix and the scaffolding that we'd be putting there, as you know, we have some funding to start talking about statewide assessments and making sure those assessments are aligned with the core. And it would be our hope that those who are teaching the test and those who are teaching the core are teaching the same thing. But I also know that right now that doesn't happen in every subject matter at every grade level.
Well, and I'm just going to repeat what I said before. I don't think the tests really test whether we're always really test whether we're teaching the core. So we need something besides tests.
Right. Can I just comment on one thing? That was one of the key pieces of feedback we received last year, was how concerned that teachers were that would be such an important factor in their total evaluation, and why we specifically broke down the evaluation into these 3 different categories and try to figure out the appropriate weighting in partnership with our local districts based on these concerns. We are also, as you know, just now implementing adaptive testing in some significant ways through some of the pilot schools, just now made decisions for our statewide adaptive testing model for the subjects we can use for that technology. And it's just gonna take us time to figure out, but you need to know that from a legislative perspective and from a state office of education viewpoint, we want to be very careful with this and make sure that we have a fair and valid set of instruments and a balance in the weighting of those scores when it comes to a teacher's evaluation and administrating.
But again, if the only way you're gonna measure student growth is standardized tests, that's still 40% of my score.
Understood. If that's the weighting that we actually choose,
Yeah.
right, at the end of the day, because that's the way it looks like it's headed. But maybe that's not where it's gonna end up for us.
And again, there's been no decision at this point in time that that's gonna be the only measure, okay? What we're talking about as one measure, and in some situations, it may be the only measure, but if we haven't, there's no decision on that. The other thing I can tell you is I sat in a meeting, not too long ago at the UEA offices, and one of the concerns there was, all we do is test and test, so we want to be careful
Yes.
not to, try to,
Test out everything.
test out everything, because we also know that's that's something you're not going to catch by the tail. You're just going to keep running around and around.
So-
I appreciate the idea of writing the student learning objectives too, but that means there'll be workshops to learn how to write student learning objectives. And then there'll be meetings where we all collaborate to write student learning objectives. And then there'll be more meetings where we learn how to implement the student learning objectives. And maybe in 5 years, we'll actually have time to implement them in our classroom.
Let's just go with, we had several other hands if we could. Let me just go here and then we'll go here and then come back to you if that's all right.
Well, the recommendation I just had,
Yep.
what I was asked, is that with this answer, would it be possible to grade it, to phase in, rather go jump right to a 40% evaluation? Would be over years, maybe until we were certain that that test was a valuable source of information, that we could phase in the level at which it weights in on what teachers do.
It's good feedback. So the recommendation is to phase in as we gain confidence in the test's reflection of, fair enough, great feedback. Let's go to this woman here and then up here in front.
I'm Gail Sardoni. I'm a special educator in Iron County School District at Cedar. All that's going through my head is why? Why did we go there? What spurs legislator to put their input in writing and put it over school districts when originally when we set up schools in America, they were local. And we were answering to school boards and doing what our local people wanted us to do. Why did you even go there?
So are you asking in the context, why did the legislature even do this bill with all the education groups?
Yes.
Well, it's a fairly simple answer. One that may not, and we've discussed this before, I think it was in this room where we had this conversation, was that the legislature's primary responsibility and accountability is how funds are appropriated. Over 63% of the state's total funds go into public education. And when we look at the results of public education from a public perspective, the level of satisfaction as to what the results are then come back on the legislature and say, are you spending your dollars the most wisely that you can? Are we getting our bang for our buck? And it's a catch-22, because the reality is that the legislature are not experts in public education. However, your peers in the UEA, in the Superintendent's Association, State Office of Education, are, and they're working with us now. Hopefully we'll see more of this collaborative effort over time to create legislation that really reflects your world and tries to bridge this gap between the accountability of how we spend our funding and the results we're getting in public education, and together we can solve it. It's a very fair question though. Yes, ma'am.
And that brings up too, all of the information we get from the United States, let's go there, where Utah is 50th in public funding per child and like 36th in our performance. So we are getting an A+ according to 50th and 36th, where maybe if we were 36th, would be second in the nation. So I don't understand
great question.
why we aren't looking at that.
So let me respond by saying it's an absolutely fair statement. The accountability back to the legislature for are we adequately funding public education? So let me just respond with this statement. While it is true that we are 51st in the nation, behind Puerto Rico, okay? 51st in the nation on a revenue per pupil basis. When it comes to revenue spend per the state, meaning the total percent of our budget that is spent on public education, we're in the top 10%. Where we used to be fifth, we've dropped a little bit. But as far as the total percent of our total state budget, we are in the top in the United States. And from an academic perspective, we're still doing well. We just want to do better. Collectively, we all want to do better. We want to see our kids be able to succeed in this globally competitive environment. And together, we all want to see better results. I don't think anyone in this room would not want to see us do better. But the question is very fair and a hard one that we're asking ourselves in the legislature. For example, just today, I spent the whole day in a caucus meeting listening to the reports about what's happening fiscally at the federal level and the impact that that will have on the state of Utah. Right now, we have what looks to be like a $300 million surplus, potentially, which we can allocate towards funding growth and truly funding growth in public education, meeting some of our requirements under the new Obamacare Affordable Care Act, things like that. But if the fiscal cliff that they've now kicked down the road until end of February, early March, and the debt ceiling issues actually don't get resolved, even if they do get resolved, the potential is our $300 million surplus could go to a $200 million deficit, just like that. So it is a very challenging thing as a legislator to figure out, what do we do? Now, we can certainly try and raise a lot of taxes, and politically, you all know how viable that is in the state of Utah. But at the end of the day, Utah is right now ranked as one of the number one and number two states in the nation for economic growth and business growth because of our conservative tax policy. So we're balancing all these things in the air, and I don't offer that as an excuse. We are responsible for the funding in public education as a legislature, and we ought to be evaluated for how we're managing that for you. Just like teachers and administrators are responsible and evaluated for the work that you do. I just want you to know I get that. Can I come to here, then we'll come back to you? Just want to make sure we get around everyone. Go ahead, sir.
I have two questions and an announcement. I'll stand up in case you have some. Apparently there's a white Ford car in the parking lot. All right. My first, yes, Steve Place. My question relates to the questions over here regarding the SLOs and the growth. I've worked on the SLO committee, and from what I understand, it's the SLOs will only be for non-tested subjects, not the tested, which is my first problem, because those of us, I taught English, those of us that were tested subjects, we don't really get to see the test. And so the growth is kind of determined in a way that's out of our hands. Those that have the SLOs get to sort of write their own growth plan. They definitely can teach to their own test and kind of determine their own growth in that manner. So the first question is, what do we do about that?
That's how long stand.
Student learning objectives.
So like an IEP, that's their goal. They write objectives and measure student progress. So it's like special education for each child.
Could be considered that way.
We started this process with the assumption that requiring all teachers to write SLOs was beyond what needed to happen because there was not a need to write SLOs in those subjects where we already had some type of measurement. So just know that our initial thoughts through this was saying, why do we have teachers go through work that's not necessary? Okay. We have heard, and again, I would appreciate your feedback about this topic, because what we end up with again is some teachers saying, well, I want to write my own SLO, and others are saying, why should I have to write my own? And so what we were saying is minimally we've got to have something in those areas where we don't have other data, but to require it in those areas where we have the other data is putting a burden on teachers that's not required and necessary. So that was our position on it. But again, I've heard, again, Dave and I, when we heard comments, there was some teachers saying, well, I want to do this. And others were saying, well, I don't, type of thing. So again, your feedback would be helpful to us on that.
I think the problem comes in, when we're we're talking performance and indefinitely paid, I would love to write my own SLO. You know, I can write my own check in a way. But, you know, for those of us that are tested, you know, that would be an option.
Well, again, I would hope and have confidence that as a profession, the integrity of teachers will uphold itself, and that all those who write SLOs won't find themselves rated at whatever the highest score would possibly be. You know, part of this process is to cause improvement and change in teacher behavior, and I would hope that we would write SLOs that would allow us to grow and make improvements as we move through the process. So again, I recognize the two sides of that, but again, just recognize that our initial position on this was saying, hey, let's not cause teachers to do something they don't have to do.
I think it's possible, like it was mentioned here with the PLC, if it was developed as a group, you know, there was some sort of process to determine what the official determination would be, would make more sense. But teacher by teacher, I just think that's disaster written all over.
Great feedback. Okay, let's go back here and then back there.
I'm Trudy Savage. I'm a reading specialist here in Iron County. I'm actually a teacher, paid on a teacher's salary, without specifically teaching kids. How would that look? Would that be the SLO idea? Or I just don't understand how you can attach part of my salary to all 600 kids in my school. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, again, somehow we need to work together to find a way to measure student achievement of students that you have some influence or impact on, so that we can have that as one of those components to this overall system of evaluating your performance.
And my other part would be, I would like the opportunity to be able to help write that up as a reading specialist or a reading coach within the state, to be a part of writing how I do.
And we appreciate your offer to do that, so thank you.
Can I just add one thing? That this process wasn't meant to be done in a vacuum. The way that we talked about this as a group and we designed this legislation was that teachers would work with teachers, that administrators would evaluate and work with teachers to decide these objectives, that we collaboratively be working together to stretch all of us and evaluate us. And I recognize that that's not a common practice, that we have to learn how to do that effectively. But I really believe that if we can address these challenges over the next couple of years and come up with a system that we can start to trust, we'll see that this process really does work. That when administration is annually evaluating performance and they're annually being evaluated, we have fair and valid instruments and we're working together to set the objectives and the stretches, that this process will benefit all of public education in Utah. That was the vision that we had.
Well, you're
yes.
absolutely right. If you have a buy-in to being helping with writing that, you are much.
You're a part of the process. Absolutely right. Yes, back here.
I got a text from one of the remote sites.
Okay.
And they said, I have two teenage sons, one stepson, and one recently adopted. They have told me that student attitude is the #1 thing that affects their education. Can you please ask how we incorporate student attitude and engagement to the evaluation equation? I would like to hear something more than engaging teachers and lessons will solve this, and we have no control over student attitude.
Well, I think
this is for MOAB.
So I'm just going to repeat the question: is where is the parental accountability, student accountability in this process? Right? Is that a fair? Yeah, and I'll just be really honest. I promise to get you. I have seen your hand.
I'm holding mine.
Oh, okay, for her. All right, you're next. You are next. I want him to be able to rest his arm. First of all, my response to that is I believe the time has come for us to, from a legislative perspective, to set clear expectation of parental involvement and student accountability. Retention is one of those areas that we're discussing, and having accountability relative to your ability to pass, and move on is part of accountability. And there's lots of pros and cons to both of that. But the time has also come for that dialogue. This bill does not address that directly, But the key thing is that there are multiple factors, not just the student growth component. There are multiple factors in the evaluation, and the way that the teacher tries to handle that, and the general support that the teacher tries to provide in that context will be taken into consideration. I realize that your questioner said, take me out of this. I want to know what we're going to do with the students. It's not answered in Senate Bill 64. And frankly, one other thing I'll say, this bill is not the silver bullet to fix public education. This is one piece of many things we've got to work on together. And that key part is together. It's not the legislature and the education community. That's what Superintendent and I are trying to fix. We're trying to bring the legislature together, work with the UEA, work with the other associations, and come up with solutions to these problems more holistically. That's my holistic view. Do you want to respond anything more to that issue? And let's go to this fine woman over here who's been waiting to answer a question.
I'm Stella Hill from South San Pedro School District. I teach English at Gunnison School, also president of our association. I just want to follow up on a couple of things that have been.
Yes, ma'am.
This English teacher over here, I think he said he teaches English. He has a really valid point. When you say that we're going to try to make it as fair as we can. Until last year, we were not even allowed in the computer room to see what was on the test. So we didn't even know how information was being presented to our students. Last year, yay, we got to at least see the formatting of how it was done and,
right.
and how they were asking the questions.
Fair enough.
And I'll just say, and maybe this was my fault, but one word that I didn't talk to my students about, applaud. And it was one of the choices on the test. So, when you're writing your own test, you're not going to put words on there that you don't think your kids know. So I do think that there's some real things that are not fair about teachers writing their own tests and us having to give the other tests that are not written by us.
Great point.
When I went to the last UEA meeting, our council of local presidents, we talked about shared student growth as being the measure of that student growth that goes into our evaluation.
Shared student growth.
Right. And I'm actually a real proponent of that because then the shop grade and the PE grade and the English grade, all the grades go together.
Right.
And that way, even if the tests aren't really exactly the same, we're going to get a student growth, a total student growth for that student.
And reinforce more collaborative teaching.
Yeah, and that way we can share it as a team, as a PLC, whatever we have in our schools.
I witnessed this as I've sat in, I've told many of you that I've spent many hours in schools sitting and watching how teachers teach and sitting in the PLC meetings and listening to them collaborate about a specific set of students and watching how these kids actually move from classroom to classroom for different subjects and how collaborative the entire teaching experience is. And I really believe that that's a critical piece of feedback.
I wasn't going to answer the political question of why we're doing this, but let me just wade into that just a little bit because I think
that's why I have one other thing.
I think it responds to what you're saying also. One of the things that I hear as I talk to legislators is we would be willing to put more money into education. We'd be willing to put more money into teacher salaries if we knew that money was going to reward the best teachers. Okay? If this process ends up totally shared growth so that everyone in a school looks the very same, the possibility of having additional funds put into teacher salary with the current legislature in Utah, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm simply saying my read on that diminishes greatly, okay? So I think we've got to make some choices here. Do we want more money in education? If we do, we're going to have to play and do some of the things that they'd like us to do, which is to differentiate so we know who are the best teachers and who are not, and then allow for some type of compensation to happen with that. So again, I value the shared concept. I talked about that before as we've looked at grade performance. But again, if you want additional funding,
for teacher salary in Utah with the current legislature, somehow we've got to differentiate so that all of that doesn't go out equally to everyone in the field. Because I'm sorry, but most legislators at least have some experience in a school where they feel that there's at least someone there who doesn't deserve additional pay as much as someone else does deserve.
Okay, so basically what you're saying then is that they really want us to compete against each other.
They don't want you to compete against each other.
That's exactly what it is.
Yes, it is.
Because that means I don't want to teach the low kids, I want to have all the good students. That's exactly.
Well, what I'm saying is.
And I understand what you're saying is that we have to play their game.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm simply saying one of the reasons this is happening is because they're saying, we'd like to give you more money, but we're not going to give that money if it goes across the board equally to everyone.
I take that then. Are
Okay.
they willing to give us some more money then for training? Because like they said, we're gonna have to learn how to do this and how to do this and how to do this.
I would hope so, because I think that one of the things where we really need to focus on in our legislative experts is professional development.
So this is I know that you're anxious to speak, and I'll let you, I promise you. What Superintendent Menlove is saying is accurate in that the legislature wants to reward great teachers. They want to. But we also have to come back and talk about Senate Bill 64. That is not, it's not set up to reward individual teachers. It's set up to evaluate individual teachers in the context of the way that their teaching is actually done in this collaborative style. That's how the bill is set up today. We designed that knowing that this feedback, that you work together, that teachers want to help one another, that they succeed as a team, and that the teachers know who the great teachers are and the weaker teachers, and together as a team they try to improve. We designed the bill with that reality in mind from an evaluation perspective. And as we get better at identifying a teacher's individual influence on a set of students, the more opportunity is created to recognize and reward uniquely teachers that add a unique, specific benefit for that group in a special way. But today the bill is written, Senate Bill 64 is written to evaluate teachers individually based on their collaborative performance or their collaborative working together. It's part of the evaluation criteria. So he's expressing the reality of our future, that we've got to bring these worlds together. That we need to recognize that collaborative teaching happens, that the administrators have to figure out how to evaluate that, and that we need to figure out how to be able to reward great individual teachers too, as we also reward the collaborative work that you do. That's the big picture. So I want to come to you, and then we need to move over to the administrators. I'd like to hear from these guys as well on these comments. Go ahead.
What I see is that legislatures have in mind the capitalist model. And we are a capitalist country, no problem with that.
Right.
The problem with that in education is we are a service model. And so we should not be compared to a capitalist model in any way whatsoever. We're a service model. If you want to compare us to a service model, you have to treat us like a restaurant. That's a service business, where it's 100% consumer driven. Or a motel, 100% consumer driven. So then you're going to have to take your money and give it to the taxpayers and let them decide where they're going to spend it. Right. Are they going to spend it at Bob's Big Boy School? Or are they going to spend it at Hotel 61 School? Or are they going to spend it at Marriott School? So the teachers at Marriott School ought to make more. But they have only a tax dollar to spend. So you can't bring teachers into the business model. It doesn't work. You have to look at us like a service model, and if you want to judge us and pay us for our merit, then it has to be consumer based. And so the parent input that is 20% really ought to be 60 or 50%.
Good feedback. Good feedback. Let's go over to we'll start here and then go in the back and then there on the side.
Okay. My name's Lyle Cox. I'm the Human Resource Director of the Washington County School District. I appreciate your willingness to take input. That's good. We read you. We all know that the method of evaluation is complex and multifaceted, right? I mean, that's the challenge you were dealing with because we're trying to narrow it down to certain factors that are measurable. But there are numerous other factors that are more difficult to measure. And one of the goals, as I understand it from this legislation, is to train and retain, keep the best educators. But one of the things that I guess I'm concerned with is, let's say that we achieve that goal to a high level, then you would see a higher number of people who are rated at the top.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, that would go against your funding scenario that would say, we should also show that we're rewarding only the best. Well, wonder if most of them, if not all of them, are the best.
Right.
So then
And we've got it to the
decide-
point that we have the best.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Okay. The other issue is reliability and validity. This evaluation instrument is based highly on the concept of being reliable and valid. And those are challenging at best to work through. But one of the most important issues relative to the reliability and validity is training, as you know.
Professional development.
Yeah, professional development, but not just with educators, with administrators.
Absolutely.
I mean, if an administrator takes this instrument and it isn't highly trained and it's intuitive what they're looking for and how they're looking for it, then they're going to use the instrument inappropriately, and the measurement methods and the comparisons that it attempts to make will be unreliable and invalid. To that extent, I'm concerned about what we place on administrators, on principals. And there's a lot of responsibility, and it's increasing, and all you need to do is watch the evening news to realize that safety is an important thing. And so their tasks are high, and I deal with them every day in these concerns. But we need to somehow allocate some of this funding that you're talking about to provide opportunities for administrators to have that training.
Absolutely.
Okay, and one more thing and I'll be done.
Keep going.
Keep going, I'm on a roll.
You're good. You sound good.
Okay, here's another issue that I don't know that you've been addressed, and it's a technicality more than a problem, but I know that in the legislation itself, it discusses rules for performance compensation, and it addresses it in that an educator may not advance on the adopted salary schedule if the educator's rating on the most recent evaluation is at the second lowest level, an evaluation instrument that differentiates between 4 levels and so forth, and so you have the 4 levels that we just discussed that are at the bottom too. Unless they're a new educator, which is the emerging category, then they could still receive it. But then you also have what I think it may be a conflict, and I don't know if it's been addressed, you may be aware of it, but in the administrative rules relative to legislative salary adjustments, it attempts to also reward educators for, if they have to be satisfactory or above in their job performance to receive the $4,200 that was legislated some time ago. I don't know if you looked at the language, but it's clearly a conflict and needs to have some legislative review. It talks about satisfactory performance in that section, and the other section, it talks about, the levels are different. So there's some problems with implementing that I hope you address.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was not aware of that conflict, and I commit to look at it.
Here, you got my note.
Thank you.
I don't think I wrote anything that was
Is there something anything bad about it? Go ahead, in the back.
Can I
sorry. Yes, sir.
respond to a couple things, Lyle? So the State Board of Education has a request in its budget, which was funded in the governor's budget also for $450,000 to do training for those who are going to be doing the evaluations, recognizing that you're absolutely right. Without some statewide consistent training and feedback, we cannot establish the validity and reliability that's required in the code here. So we recognize that it is going to take some additional time. We also recognize that principals are, overworked. And yet, there's no one else. In my opinion, if we're going to evaluate teachers, those who are close to them, it ought to be those building administrators that have that responsibility to do that. So I don't know the answer there. But there is a recognition by the state board that we've got to do some work in training statewide so that we can establish some validity in what we're doing and be reliable across districts and whatever else. That's what the request is for.
And I would, in the context of that, I understand the challenge, but if resources were made available to ease some of that burden, and it's a significant burden. I mean, you only have to go out to school for just a day to see that it's difficult to focus on some of these trying to beg for it or play for it. I'm just saying it needs to be considered.
When we talked about
Resources
this
are
bill
important across.
originally, the state office was very clear to me about the burden that we're placing. And you know, if you look into any other industry, where do you have a manager with a span of control of up to 40, 50, 60 employees that they're directly responsible for managing? And the level of complexity of the job and the diversity of the job that they have. I mean, it is a very uniquely challenging function. And it's the same thing for teachers in a classroom of 40 kids. So we recognize that, and our first step was, let's get the framework in place. Then as Superintendent mentioned, let's start funding some professional development for our administrators, and then seek professional development again for our teachers, and work this in phases. But we recognized and discussed that significantly as we put this bill together.
The other thing I'd respond to is we recognize the difference in the language between satisfactory performance and whatever else. We would like to at least get our initial report back on where we believe teachers stand now based on what's happening before we try to make some adjustments to that, recognizing that basically universally everyone gets the $4,200, and so everyone is satisfactory. I have seen the most recent report. Now, Superintendent Shumway reported a couple of years ago that there were 16 teachers statewide who didn't receive the $4,200. So we're aware that there's some language that needs to be cleaned up there. But again, I'd like to at least see some current data as to where teachers are on that 4 scale before we start making determinations about the $4,200.
And my concern is a strict implementation of the program could have an impact on that as well. So there may be some intended or unintended consequences associated with the legislative salary adjustments and the performance standards.
Yep.
So.
And I'm, again, I don't know if, you know, everyone's aware of that, but at least we've had that conversation in our office. You know, part of the conversation is that this legislation does not take salary away from anyone. It simply doesn't allow some individuals to move forward on the salary schedule. But you're right, based on the $4,200, it could end up doing some things like that. But again, I think we also need to be aware that we've talked before about $4,200 not being on salary schedule, that it's an annual determination as to whether one receives it or not. And I understand also now it's been an annual determination over the last, what's it been, 6 years now, half of it 5 years, the other half of it 5 or 6 years. And in most districts right now, there's an expectation which is part of the salary. So anyway, it's an issue we need to talk about.
Let's go back to you, sir, and then up here, and we'll come over.
My name is Rusty Taylor. I'm principal at Desert Hills High School, Washington County. Thanks for coming to visit and giving us a chance to talk back. I got to support some of the things that our teachers have been saying. Nothing will be more divisive to a school than to individually rank teachers. There's a whole lot more power as far as their success in the testing. There's a whole lot more power for me as an administrator to work collegially with my faculty and staff. The individual evaluations, right on with that. But taking an individual teacher's test scores, which has so many variables, like Catherine talked about too, that just creates separation within our schools. Whereas if you'll figure in our school overall picture, man, I've got PE teachers that are going to be working on reading and writing because that's tied to it as well. I've got English teachers that are going to be helping our math students, our school interventions that we have. Everyone works together because it matters for all of us. But as soon as, and I realize the politics of it that you talked about, but as soon as you go to that individual, there are so many more factors that are beyond everyone's control. Parental involvement, all of that impact. It makes the unfairness of that aspect so much larger that can be mitigated by the schools. Because if our school is successful, all of our teachers are successful.
Great feedback. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Kathy Peterson, Washington County.
Okay.
Again, thank you for allowing us to
You bet.
comment. I'm old and I've been in education a really long time.
You don't look old, just so you know.
But probably what I'm worried about is that we've lost the perspective of why we have schools. Students are our number one priority. We've talked about trying to be fair to teachers. We've talked about trying to be fair are rewarded, but we haven't talked about what's equitable for children or students.
Right.
And in my experience, professional learning communities with teachers collaborating, building each other, sharing the best practices that they have with each other is a win for students as well as for teachers. And if we only reward good teachers and don't do anything about the others, just let them go ahead and go along, we're cheating and hurting all of the children in the classes who are no longer getting help for their teacher because we're no longer collaborating. And I know you've addressed the issue of trying to put some of the weight into collaboration, but unless the weight of that is more than 50%, then the teachers are going to take care of themselves and their own families and not be concerned about the teacher of the hall who also has 30 students, but whose 30 students are worrying and getting an inferior education and instruction compared to what I can do. But if I'm working in a collaborative PLC, I can help that teacher if you put 50% or more of the reward into collaboration. If you put 10% or one piece of the teacher evaluation into it, I'm not going to go down the hall, or most teachers are not going to go down the hall and take time from my preparation and my students and my RTI to help somebody else.
Excellent feedback. I think you summarized beautifully what has been discussed so far.
I have one other
Yes, ma'am.
concern, and that's with the evaluation tool. I know we're taking a long time to put that together, and I think that's wise. You wouldn't want to rush this and use something that was appropriate or that didn't work well. But right now, the state is telling us that districts may choose an evaluation tool as long as it fits the X criteria, X and Y or whatever it is. I have a concern that that will only make inequity across the state. If we are truly interested in ensuring that every student have an equitable education, I believe that there ought to be a tool that will work for all of us. Not Beaver having one and Washington having another and Emory having another.
And again, my response would be, we're trying to be responsive to those districts who are saying, hey, we already have a tool we really like. We'll make adjustments to our tool to cause it to be, similar. I know they're not going to be exact, but at least comparative to a tool that's going to be developed. And so again, we're trying to be responsive to those who are saying, help us, we need that tool, and others who are saying, leave us alone. So again, right now the position is we will develop an instrument and we will evaluate others who would like to use a different instrument against that instrument to make sure they're comparable.
Could I ask one other question while you're here? If a teacher receives a satisfactory, or say a 3 out of the 4 categories, and their test scores come in as very poor, or students losing, instead of making progress, losing, not making any gains, what will be the state's response?
Well, again, the overall score will take into account student achievement, student attributes, and then this parental survey. So very likely one may have a 2 on one of those, a 3 on one, and a 5 on the other one, and therefore an average of a 3. I don't know the exact details of that, right, honestly, but.
So would disparity bother you?
Well, I don't think there's any question that you're going to find some teachers, I think I said earlier, I've never seen a direct correlation between who I thought were the best teachers and student test scores. So I assume through this process, you're going to have some teachers who are going to score high when they're looking at those administrative evaluated attributes. And that may correlate with student scores and may not correlate with student scores.
If that doesn't correlate with student scores, why are we doing it?
Well, I just want to say one thing on that, because I realize that in evaluations, it takes multiple criteria into consideration.
it is very possible, like for example, in this special education case that we were talking about, that a student scores, there wouldn't be significant student progress. There could even be students that are struggling. And there are real context and reasons behind that, but the teacher is doing a phenomenal job dealing with the dynamics of the classroom and other issues. So I think even at the state level, of course we want to see student progress as a significant indicator. But in every case, that's not going to be the case, and we recognize that. Just like in the private industry, that's the case. There are multiple factors that go into an individual's evaluation. It's not always the financial results.
But
So,
if you use the UCAS scores, the students are only compared to their peer group.
right.
And so
Let me jump to that other topic. So what the legislature wants and what the State Office of Education is trying to accommodate is our ability to have a standardized testing system that we can not only compare school to school, but from other states and be able to establish that norm of performance. It's a very challenging political situation right now. I'll just quickly explain that there are those in the legislature that hate the idea of the Common Core and being compared to any other state and wanting to have our own results and our own data and manage ourselves. And then there are those in the legislature that want to have nationally normed data, national core and Common Core, be able to see and hold education accountable for performance against other states. And that there's even some in the State Office of Education that argue on this point. So I just want to put out that there's challenges, but in general, the direction and intent of the legislation is to have comparative data statewide, school to school, and to allow for some flexibility initially for those schools and systems that have already invested in some of this adaptive testing capability as we transition to a centralized system. Is that a fair summary, Superintendent? Now, it's 8:15. We promised that we would go until 8:30. But I just wanted to see how many, just by raising hand, how many of you have more questions, just really quickly? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so let's start with this woman in the back here who I know had been waiting patiently. Then we'll come over here and then come back to this side, over there. Okay, go ahead, ma'am.
Appreciate the time.
Thanks for your time as well.
Jet, and I teach mathematics at Parowan High School. My concern, and maybe you could just address it a little bit, is concerning the student-parent evaluation part. In the college experience, we all got to evaluate our professors because we were in the classroom.
And you paid to be in the classroom.
Yeah. Thank you. And then, but we all need to put ourselves back in 8th grade or 9th grade and remember what we were like and what fun it was to evaluate our teachers when we had our pituitary gland going our brain. And I'm kind of worried about how that part would work.
Yeah.
How it could be common for everyone to teach at all different levels because all of our students are at different levels.
Right.
Also, we put the parents with that situation. The parents don't attend my class, but they do hear what their children say.
Right.
And I feel like, I teach math, so kids like to come to my class sometimes just about as much as they like to go to the dentist. So I would like, I think I do a pretty good job sometimes, and I try really hard, and I work really long hours. I would like to know more about that piece before I make a judgment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very great. And my initial response is that one of the things that we wanted to do was to empower the state office and the local district offices to figure out how that component would be developed in a way that would be fair. Having parental input, at the end of the day, the parents and the children are the consumer of the product or service that we're offering. And we want to get some of that feedback and appropriately reflected in a way that's fair. And I'll let the superintendent talk about it from that point.
We have done less on that component than anything else, so we're still, very much in just planning and talking stages, but I've taken some notes and you're right on, and I think you've expressed concerns consistent with others who expressed concerns, and obviously you can't have the same instrument for first graders with smiley faces on as you can for seniors and whatever else. So again, it's just an area we haven't really delved into yet, but we'll obviously.
Okay, so we'll come back over here now to, go ahead, sir.
I'm not a sir, I work for a living. My name is Rick Pruitt. I retired after 30 plus years as a teacher and a counselor at Richfield High School, and now I get the privilege of working with 10 school districts as a UNICEF director. First thing, I'd like to thank you for coming and listening to us. And I'll tell you that those speed limits are really only a suggestion. But overwhelmingly.
We have your mailing address.
I don't, you can't get there from here.
I'm not worried about me getting there, he's worried about the ticket getting there.
More than anything else, as I go to these other districts, I hear just 1 year, leave us alone. Don't add something new this year. Teachers and administrators have done so much for so long with so little. They can do damn near anything with nothing. And just 1 year, let us keep trying to do what we do.
Well, first of all, I just want to tell you that I honor what you do. The teaching profession is something that I greatly value, and the reason why I spend the time that I do to come out and meet directly with you is because I respect the great profession that you have. And I hope that over time we can reinforce the perception of this profession as something to be proud of in this state. I actually joked in the last meeting we were at that I would like to pass a piece of legislation that says that no more legislation can be passed for 5 years in public education. Wouldn't that be great? And so, but I do want to share with you though that there's hope. That the legislature, the attitude within the legislature is shifting. It's an attitude of what can we do? This collaborative thing can work. And what happened last year with Senate Bill 64 and other efforts that took place last year created some hope. And we still have the divisive elements in the legislature that want to do everything they can to completely gut and change the way we do things in public education. But it's good for the dialogue. But the general feeling of the legislature, I believe, Aaron Osmond speaking now in my second session, is that we want to work with the legislature or with the public education groups. We want to work it out together with you. And then when the Senate president started off the year by saying, let's stop doing individual one-off pieces of legislation when it comes to education. Let's have a plan. What is our 10-year plan? And is this legislation that we're working on in the Senate consistent with that plan? He has chartered the 3 heads of the education committees to sit down with those that care and come up with that plan, and I'm one of them. And that plan is going to be based on what the State Board of Education has already adopted and promises to keep, and other ideas and visions that they have. And we want to create an environment where we're balancing our legislation against that. So I just want you to know, things are changing, attitudes are shifting. There's still some contention, I recognize that. Can't avoid that. And there's still going to be some education bills. Sorry. But I am going to fight very hard that anything related to Senate Bill 64, that they let us have a chance to let this work before they try to change anything about this bill. That's my commitment to you. All right, back here.
My name's Alan Wood from Myerston School in Beaver District, and we're from pilot ones. As we've been working through it, there's a lot of time that it takes for the teacher and especially the principal. We're a small school. I could imagine a big school. I don't know how the principal can get around and do all the evaluations. And so I see, back to the money issue again. That principal would carry out their other duties also. Have to hire secretaries or assistants. There's more money taken out of our chunk of education. The other thing, we've talked about teachers, we've talked about principals. I've taught quite a few years. I've had good superintendents and district office workers, or district administrators, and I've had poor ones. There's some way we could add, because they're part of the whole game. We have those in there also with the teachers and principals.
You mean the district superintendents?
Yep, and they're, nice curricular.
That is the next level of conversation that we're going to be having. Great points on both levels. Want to add anything to that? Okay. All right, come up here and then back there.
June Miller, I teach 7th grade here in Iron County. I'm also the Iron County ICA president. What I see is a couple of comments that the superintendent made and a couple of comments that you have made that when you read this back, you still don't know what this is going to look like. And that causes the fear and the anxiety in this room across this state. And I'm going to compare it to something that we're all experiencing right now.
Okay.
Because the federal government just changed our lunch program.
Mm-hmm.
And it has created enormous waste, unfathomable waste, unintended consequences, what Lyle was saying. And we're afraid of this. We're afraid of the unintended consequences that is going to penalize good teachers, that is going to limit principals' effectiveness because they're doing nothing but evaluating, that is going to stifle schools. And that's what we're afraid of, those unintended consequences. We can't have the entire bill in front of us all the time to make sure that every single I is dotted and T is crossed. The SLOs aren't fair. The testings aren't fair. We can't see the test. We can't write our SLOs. All of that stuff has been brought up here. And so now, what are you going to do about that? How is that going to be appeased? How is that going to help us in this state realize that you really do want to do something good, but what are going to be the unintended consequences and who suffers for it? I'm a National Board Certified teacher. 40% of my students are resource students. I'm going to get 60% on this evaluation because I will not meet that student progress. My kids can't score it. They can't. So that 40% of my student progress is gone. So I get 60% of that. Does that make me a 3? Does that make me a 2? Does that put me on 120 days of probation? Is that going to be tied to that lower level? All of these things are just too scary. And so we need some more answers.
Well,
before we can give our support.
Let me just repeat that to make sure I understood what you said.
Okay.
So your concern is because we haven't been able to give you the concrete specifics right now about how it's going to work and how it will really affect you personally. That the level of anxiety and fear, not just for you personally, but for the teachers you know, is high. And that you're very worried that because we don't have answers, that even creates more fear that what happens in the next year or the next 2 years is this just going to come down to the point where you just get fired because you're just not meeting the expectation. Well, first of all, let me say I completely understand that anxiety. It's the reason why we're here. And the commitment that we have is that we'll keep coming out and keep listening and keep participating with you in partnership with your leaders on the UEA side as well. I've had regular communications with Sharon on the anxieties and concerns that she's hearing.
And that we appreciate because you are the first, and as far as I know, one of the very few. And I applaud you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. I want you guys to know, though, that we understand that. We feel that from you. We're worried about it, too. And our commitment is we'll keep coming. And let's just have this on an annual basis. Let's make sure that we're making progress. I will once again give you my email address this evening. If you want to write it down and share your other thoughts and feelings, I do read them and I do take them into consideration. And just real quick, it's AV, as in Victor, Osmond, @gmail.com. Okay? Send me email if you have a concern. But at the end of the day, I just want you to know we hear you. We agree that there's a reason to be concerned. And I just want to personally applaud also the State Office of Education, who have spent dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of hours trying to work with district leaders and teachers across the state to put together these instruments. And I've been in the meetings where they say the same things to me, that they're concerned about the weight put on administrators and the weight put on our teachers, and is it the best thing for our kids? So I just want to validate that, and anything, ask you, Superintendent, if you want to add anything to that.
no, other than, I don't have the answers. I think together, I think we can come up with them. I think we can answer the questions. I think we can get there. But it is gonna take some time. It's gonna take some effort. And I just invite you to come along as we work towards that. And we want your feedback. We want to hear from what you're doing. We want to hear your concerns. We want to anticipate the unintended consequences so we can resolve them. And, but again, it is going to take some time. And again, if you're looking to me for answers, it's, I'm going to basically look back because we've got to do this together.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes. How many hands were up that originally were up when I asked the last time? Okay, right back there, over here, and this woman right here, okay? Last 3, and then we're going to wrap up, and if you have other questions, come up afterwards to see me, okay? Go ahead, sir.
My name's Eric. More of a comment than a question.
Yes, sir.
It's kind of been voiced here. Historically, efforts at merit pay has been more successful in creating low staff morale than it has in student performance. And if we lose that focus, we lose regardless of how complex a system you come up with.
Right.
It is a complex system. You can't do it in a simple manner. And there will be lots of problems and lots of conflict.
We have seen that in research over and over again. I've been sent research by great teachers from literally all over the country that direct merit pay for individual teacher performances is not an effective morale system. But our system wasn't designed as merit pay, except for the administrators. That was the big difference. And so we can talk more about that afterwards, but I just want to be clear that I'm very, very clear on that issue. And as I speak and interact with my colleagues, I personally don't believe in merit pay, teacher individual merit bonuses. I believe in a system that rewards collaborative performance. I really do believe that personally. And that we want to be able to recognize our teachers, our individual teachers, and recognize their contributions to the team. But merit pay is not the personal solution I believe in as a legislator when it comes to teachers. Now, it's much different for me for administrators. I believe that administrators do own the quality of instruction in the school. They are the reflection of the total collaborative effort in the management of performance, and they ought to be directly recognized and rewarded based on the performance of the school over time. That's Aaron Osmond's view. So hold on a second. We've got to go to those individuals. Come see me after, okay? All right, let's go over to here.
Really quickly, equity education. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. You're a strong believer in having an equal education for every kid, okay? Couple things with that. First thing is that charter schools were completely left out of this. And if we're talking about equity, and if we're going to be talking about making sure that every kid is getting a good education, then why are we leaving those out? They need to be included in this.
Great feedback. Absolutely.
Number 2 is that we keep hearing this collaboration, teacher collaboration, but at the same time, right now, we're talking about having approximately a 20-40-40 kind of a rule, where 40% is based upon a teacher's individual accomplishments, and a small part of the 40% is for collaboration. So this is not right now looking at all like it's designed for teacher collaboration. If this were designed as teacher collaboration, a majority of that would be pointed towards it. You'd have 40% towards the team's goals, those types of things, or the school's goals. It's different in secondary than elementary.
Yeah,
Elementary, you can clearly say a first grade team, a second grade team, a third grade team. In the secondary, it's, you know what, you've got so many other things that come in that are not tested, PE, music, drama, all these other things where they're fighting for the kids' time. And if we're really concentrating on our history and our science and our math and our literacy, and that's what we really care about, then they ought to be scored off of what those test scores are, because they can contribute towards that. They can make sure that those kids are released if they need to come into those classes and get the remediation and so forth, and that can happen. But it needs to be in that some type of a thing there. There was a comment made earlier about this being a service industry, and I just have to say I don't agree with that at all.
Okay.
We are not a service industry. A service industry is not made to provide equal access to every single person, and that's what we are. We aren't a business model. We We are in a service industry. We are a government entity that is supposed to provide services equally to every one of these kids that they can all get what they need to be successful. Thank you.
Excellent. You should be up here, my friend. I'm planning on running for the legislature because you are a great communicator. I'm sorry, don't plan any ideas? Okay, I'm sorry. If there's any one message we walk away with tonight, it's your anxiety about the collaborative nature of the student growth scores. Okay, I got it, locked and loaded. And I know that he took some great notes, and I'm sorry that I didn't have my pad with me, but I know he did.
You seem to agree with the charter question, and they get 1.2% of the WPU. I mean,
Depends.
We had this conversation.
He is fully informed me on this issue.
Well, not just me, all the businesses.
No, it was you. No, it was a great conversation. Okay, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Perry Edwards, Washington County. I work at Pearl Canyon Elementary. One of the concerns that we're hearing from our teachers is that they have heard the rumor, is there a limit, high or low, on the 4 performance categories of so many educators that can be ranked in that area? And also, the rumors going around that my principal said I may be proficient and very good in all categories, but I have to give you a basic in at least one area. Is there any truth to that?
No, zero. There's nothing in the legislation that calls for a bell curve.
Can you send that email to our principal?
Well, yeah, in fact, what I was planning on doing, just so that you know, is we were planning on taking the most commonly asked questions and the answers and sending them out to the entire school system from me, so that everyone can see in writing what it is that, you know, we said to everyone. And so after these meetings are over, I intend on putting those answers together, running it past the state office, and then we're going to send that out to the entire education system so they have that as a reference point. And they can talk with their administrators and teachers back and forth. But there is nothing in there that talks about a bell curve, nothing that says they have to rate you at a minimum or a base score in order to, you know, meet some obligation of the law. Please just understand that was not the intent of Senate Bill 64.
But they do it,
They do what?
what she said. Rather than giving an outstanding teacher outstanding marks in every area, they give some people. I can't.
In the way they evaluate today is what you're saying, that administrators have done that?
Oh, yeah.
We'll just,
down than a month ago.
well, we will, rather than create a battle on that issue, let's just agree that the intent of Senate Bill 64 is not to do that moving forward. Fair?
I would just say there's nothing in the board rules or the code that indicate that, but I'd also have great respect for local boards of education and local administrations, and they can make those type of decisions if they choose to do that.
Well, how's that equitable then? That creates disequity among the districts in the state. If this district says, well, we can only give this number of distinguished and this number, and we are going to give this number of basic, and this district does not do the same thing. That's not an equitable evaluation system.
That is a great question. And can I take that as a comment that I'll take back with superintendent? Because our intent is we believe in local control in a significant way. We wrote this bill so that the maximum amount of flexibility could be left up to the state office of education and our local school boards to work together to come out with a consistent set of systems. I do concur that it would be unfair that if one school district had a completely different rating system versus another school district, that there ought to be basic components that every district has. I think that's what you were intending. But again, the whole point is we wanted to write this to allow for the criteria and the way it was implemented to have some local flexibility so you could deal with your unique challenges as districts and schools. Now with that, guys, we have to wrap. But I just want to say my closing comments and then turn over to superintendent. The purpose, again, behind Senate Bill 64 was to refocus our attention on leadership in our schools. I'm looking very hard at the administrators with great respect of the burden that you have, but we want to raise the level and quality of instruction in the way that you manage and deal with people. Your interpersonal and management skills are very important to me personally, just like I would be from a management standpoint in a company. You are the leadership, the quality of education in the state. And you need to know and be the best of the best out there from an administrative standpoint for us to take our state to the next level. And then for the teachers, We are extremely grateful for the hard work that you do with the few resources that we give. We do need to evaluate performance and come up with a way that's fair and reliable, and I believe that this bill accomplishes that balance. And we ask for you to work with us, help us improve it. We'll keep coming out, we'll keep seeking feedback. And with those comments, I just want to thank you for your time this evening, how much I appreciate your willingness to listen to us and be here this evening. Superintendent?
I would just echo Senator Osmond's thank you. I appreciate what you do. Recognize that what you do, particularly those of you in the classrooms and in the schools every day, are really where things happen, and thank you for that. And again, let's keep talking. I think you know how to get hold of me if you have some comments, suggestions, whatever else. But again, thanks for your time and thanks for what you do on a daily basis. So thank you.
Thank you.